Yeah, formally, game theory is a branch of mathematics that studies how to make the optimal strategic choice under uncertainty to win a game, starting with in two-player zero-sum games like chess or the Cold War. And it was formalized kind of in the World War II era. There was a book written by von Neumann, the great physicist, mathematician, thinker, and a guy named Morgenstern on game theory and economics. And it's interesting that it was those two together because so much of how our economic system works is based on the same concepts. Game theory has been happening forever. It wasn't called game theory, it's just called strategy, right? It's just we hadn't been able to apply some of the tools of math and computation that were able to be applied at that time. But if you're reading Sun Tzu or you're reading Machiavelli or you're reading any kind of general discussing military strategy, they're basically talking about how do you win a rivalrous game where you don't know what the opponent is doing. And where obviously, depending upon what they're doing, some moves would be great moves, some moves would be terrible moves. Obviously, this is chess. This is any kind of game dynamic like that. So there's the most famous first study in game theory that many people have heard of is the prisoner's dilemma. And I won't describe the prisoner's dilemma in detail here. People can check it out online. But the idea is you and a buddy are both in jail. You're both being investigated. You're both being given a kind of plea type option. If you both cooperate with not kind of ratting each other out, it's the best solution for both of you. But if the other guy rats you out and you don't, it's the worst solution for you personally. And if you end up ratting on the other guy and he doesn't, it's less bad for you than if you both kind of keep the dynamic in. So what is found out is that under the uncertainty where you don't know what the other guy is going to do, the tendency is to assume the worst and move into a position of kind of maximum selfishness, maximum rivalry. And you can imagine in situations of warfare, if you don't know how much armament the other guy has, you don't know how aggressive their interests are, you want to assume the worst case scenario and try to plan to be able to win under the worst case scenario, which ends up meaning, and the other guy is doing the same thing. If, let's say, they're offering an agreement, but you know they might defect on their agreement, which happens all the time, right? Stalin and Hitler were participating when it was serving both of their interests, and then Hitler defects on Stalin when it's not aligned with his interests. So in game theory, there's something called a coordination game, which is you actually don't compete against someone. You coordinate with them when it's in your interest to coordinate, but then you reserve the right to defect on them when that's in your interest. And not just in military situations, you see that in, say, class dynamics. The upper class might all coordinate with each other with regard to tax policies for the upper class, while simultaneously competing for who has positions of maximum power within that class. A whole industry, like, say, the AI sector or oil, might coordinate with each other for getting the regulations they want for the sector, while then all competing for who has the most market share. So under a game theoretic scenario, there is no such thing as allies for real. There is no such thing as like friends or loyalty. There's frenemies at best. And the frenemy scenario is, as long as we have shared interests, I can expect a certain degree of cooperation. As soon as we don't have shared interests, I can expect defection. So we're continuously planning for selfishness and defection. And that takes up also a huge amount of bandwidth. This ends up explaining a tremendous amount about how the world works, militarily, economically, politically, diplomatically, where we're making an agreement while assuming the other guy will defect, while they are assuming we will defect. We're trying to figure out how to spy on their defection while being able to confuse their spies, and those types of dynamics are a huge amount of the coordination failures of the world. And there are some things that game theory and game theoretic thinking, even before it was formalized in math, the formalization of it just made it much more powerful and much more ubiquitous. And now you can run it on computers and run it on AI. So we can see AI being able to run those types of models, beats humans at chess, beats humans at Go, beats humans at StarCraft, now is increasingly beating humans at more generalized things like obviously trading, economic trading, and even comprehensive war planning and targeting of missiles and all those things. So one type of game theoretic scenario that defines a lot of properties of the world is if there are a number of players, a number of actors, let's call it tribes or countries or companies or whatever, and One of them does something that provides a lot of near-term advantage for them. It might be doing something particularly destructive, like, say, let's take an early kind of tribal analogy. Rather than only taking what they need from nature, they're starting to cut down a lot more timber to be able to create surplus. And you have a scenario where they can then use that surplus in different ways to be able to win at tribal warfare. So now you take the other tribes. If they don't do the same thing, it doesn't protect the forest because the other guy's going to cut down the forest anyways. And if they don't do the same thing, they might not even be able to protect their people. And so now, even if they didn't want to, they have to race to cut down the forest faster just for their own need to survive. And so you get this scenario where there's kind of a race to exploit the commons. And whether that's fishing or hunting or, any kind of exploitation from the environment, oil. So you have a situation called the tragedy of the commons, which is a kind of social trap is one of the terms, or multipolar trap, where the net scenario of what everyone is racing to do makes the worst possible world for everyone, but nobody can stop it, because if anyone stops, it's so much worse for them in the short term, and they can't assure that the other guy's not going to do it. And so the idea that because they are doing it, we have to, you end up having a world that nobody wants, but nobody feels they can choose otherwise. And this is such a deep thing to understand because, like, let's say you take any of the major environmental issues of the time. I'm going to take climate change because probably most of your listeners think that's a thing. For those who don't, you can apply it to species extinction or chemical pollution or any of these issues. Literally nobody actually wants climate change. Like, there's no one for whom climate change is their strategic objective. And yet, and the whole world actually, in terms of the G20, the United Nations, all of the major countries of the world have acknowledged climate change is a major issue. We all want to stop it. There's $1 trillion in climate-related funding happening every year. There's the IPCC having huge supercomputers supported by NASA and NOAA. There's international agreements. And yet every single year we use more fossil fuels than the year before. All of the renewables, all of the solar, all of the everything, we haven't even slowed the rate of increase of fossil fuel use. And so we obviously don't know how to stop climate change. Everybody thinks that it's a particularly bad thing. The UN estimates that about 1 billion refugees from extreme weather events and climate change will happen in the next decade. And the world has no way to deal with 1 billion refugees. And so we can't stop it, and yet nobody wants it. What they want is energy for every other purpose, and that's one of the side effects of it. And no one feels that they could price energy properly or be able to consume less, because let's say the US priced energy properly, meaning it right now we price oil as how much it costs us to extract it from the ground plus a tiny margin, not what it took nature to make or what it would take for us to clean up the environmental effects. So obviously most of the costs are externalized to the environment. If we were to start to try to price it more properly so that you could produce it in a way that didn't have the negative environmental effects, but say China didn't, then they would have more margins than us. They would beat us. That's the multipolar trap. And the same happens in arms races, the advancement of military tech. If they're making AI drone weapons and the AI drone weapon is going to comprehensively outperform the weapons that are run by humans, then we have to make AI drone weapons. And if we don't know exactly what type they're making, we have to spy on them, obviously. And we have to run counter intel on their spies. But we also have to assume that they're making all of the worst possible ones, plus defenses, and try to get comprehensive advantage, allocate larger and larger military budgets. And you get a world in which there is increasing destructive power with nuclear weapons, cyber weapons, hypersonic delivery of nuclear weapons, drone weapons, etc. And again, literally nobody wants to live in the world with AI drone weapons, but also no one feels that they can stop it. And so this multiplayer game theoretic dilemma, where under uncertainty, you assume the worst case scenario, you race ahead. The net result is this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, is the other guy, it does do that thing, whether he was going to or not, because he thinks you're going to. And you're saying the only reason you are is because you think they are. And the world you end up getting is maximum environmental destruction, maximum weapons, maximum distrust, etc.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story where a town has no lawyers, so there's no lawsuits. And then it has one lawyer and there's still no lawsuits. And then it gets 2 lawyers and all of a sudden everybody's suing each other. Yeah. So it's kind of like, I don't need a security guard unless you have a security guard. And then I'm wondering, is this just built into human nature, this issue?
No. And the reason you can say no kind of confidently is because there are examples of groups of humans who bound these kinds of social traps effectively for periods of time, which means human nature is capable of doing that thing. Human nature is obviously capable of doing this thing, obviously very well, but it's not that human nature obligately does it. It's that human nature under conditioning environments does it. So this is a very important thing to understand about human nature. Let's take a look at the Jains, right? The Eastern religion that emphasizes nonviolence more seriously than most do. So much so that they really go out of their way to never hurt a bug. If they're going to build a house, they remove all the bugs first so they don't hurt any bugs. They eat fruits and nuts that fall from the plants, but they won't even kill plants to eat them. The existence of the Jains as decently large populations over long periods of time mean that you can have not just a particularly nonviolent person, but a whole culture of people that all get enculturated to live that way. So human nature allows Jains, right, as one example. But then you can also look at, say, the Janjaweed and child soldier utilizing demographic in Sudan, where by the time someone gets to puberty, pretty much everyone has murdered people. And in that environment, if you don't participate with that thing, you don't make it to puberty. And so again, you have a situation in which you can have the entire population. I'm sorry, someone knocked.
Oh, it's all good. So we were talking about the
You can have
Jains
a
and then
scenario where,
yeah.
What's that?
Oh, so we were talking about the Jains and then we were talking about child soldiers.
Yes. So you can have populations that have radically different distributions of how violent or how non-violent people are. You can have populations where the level of education is radically different, even independent of the economics. When you look at, say, the Jews in the pogroms in Russia, the way they invested in the education of the kids, even in positions of near slavery and total poverty, there was a culture kind of dynamic. So human nature, it's a very important thing to understand about human nature is that unlike all the other animals, because of our capacity for tool building, we didn't stay limited to one niche that our bodies had evolved to be able to work well in. The cheetah is amazing for one niche. It would do very bad in the Arctic. And the polar bear would do very bad in the savannah. So they stay in their niche, right? But you notice that humans moved everywhere. And humans ended up becoming like the apex predators everywhere because they were able to put on skins and build houses and change their tooling set so that they could be adaptive and actually apex predator and then environment dominating in all the spaces. So if you look at the life of a cheetah or a polar bear today versus a cheetah or a polar bear 10,000 years ago in their natural environment, what makes them adaptive is pretty much the same thing. So they get to have kind of built-in genetic code, nature for how to be that thing that co-evolved with their environment and co-evolved with their body. But what it means to be an adaptive human today versus 10,000 years ago or even 50 years ago is totally different. Most people today are not awesome at spear throwing, even though that was a super useful skill. We're very good at texting and other things. So because we change our tooling stack, change our languages, change the environments we're in, change the types of political economies we're in, we have to change our nature. We have to change deep aspects of how we perceive the world, how we make sense of the world, and how we behave. So a key aspect to humans is a profound amount of plasticity. Because we change our environment so much, we have to kind of get, rather than hardwired, kind of like software adapted to the unique environments that we're in, which is also part of why human children are kind of incapable of self-dynamics, right? They're called neotenous, embryo-like for so long. A horse is up walking in 20 minutes. It takes a human child a year to be walking because they don't come with the built-in imprint because they're going to have to learn a language. They're going to have to learn all of these things, right? And as a result, human nature is very radically plastic. So if we want to look at environments where there were tribes that were not only relatively more peaceful within the tribe, but relatively more peaceful between the tribes, we can see those examples. We can see them in the Iroquois Confederacy. We can see them in examples of intertribal agreement in the Aborigines, where they didn't define things via multipolar traps. They came into intertribal councils, had conversations, had agreements, kept the agreements, had enforcement that worked. So is it is it human nature that we can do game theory? Yes. Is it human nature that we must? No.
Mm.
But when someone else starts doing it, it becomes obligate to do it or lose. And this is kind of the key thing. So it's not human nature, it's system dynamics that make it obligate. So there's a whole bunch of things that we think of as human nature because they're happening everywhere, because they're ubiquitous conditioning, because they became obligate. And so this is such an important example. So, there are, on your show in particular, there are people that contest how long humans have been around. But the standard narrative is sapiens have been around 200 to 300,000 years, a pretty long time. And for all of that time, standard narrative, we were hunters and gatherers, right? Pre having the plow. In all the hunter-gatherer cultures around the world, from what we can tell, they were pretty much all animistic. And anytime there's something that occurs everywhere, it's an interesting thing, right? It means it's kind of a property of evolution that arises. It is something closer to like nature.
What does
And
animistic mean?
They related to the spirit of everything, the spirit of the tree, the spirit of the buffalo, the spirit of the river, the spirit of the moon. And so animism is the idea that everything is animated by the great spirit in some way and has their own kind of unique spirit to them. So if you study any kind of indigenous culture, the way they would, okay, we're going to hunt a buffalo and we will actually cry when we kill the buffalo. We'll make prayers. We will say that when our body goes into the ground when we die, it'll become the grass that their ancestors will eat in the great cycle of life. But there's a respect for the spirit of the buffalo, right? So when we figured out the plow, kind of the ox-drawn plow, we had to figure out how to take a buffalo, domesticate it, castrate it, yoke it, and whip it all day to do that thing. You couldn't continue to be animistic, and you had to move into worldviews that were like man's dominion over nature. The animals were put here to serve us. Man was made the king of the kingdom, that kind of thing. Whereas the Chief Seattle quote, "We are not the web of life. We're merely a little strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves." Those are very different worldviews. But you can't run the plow and be animistic. And not only that, but because the plow allows you to do this long row cropping, which of course, if I'm gathering, I'm not going to get anything like that. To do the long row cropping, I need a lot of land allocated to agriculture, so I clear cut a forest first. So the plow was not only the domination of the animals, but also of the land and ecosystems, right? And so a worldview arises, and this is a separate point, but that's important, is a lot of people, naively, I used to think that technology is not good or bad. It's kind of neutral. It's an empowerment. It's a tool. We can use it for whatever we want. We can use a hammer to kind of beat someone's head, but we can also use a hammer to build houses for the homeless. So a hammer is not good or bad. This is not true. Tools actually have values built into them that they end up conditioning in the population that uses them. On the Consilience Project, we wrote a whole paper on this called "Technology is Not Values Neutral." But the plow is a very good example. You have this tool called the plow, but in order to use it, it's a totally different behavior, right? Now I am doing animal husbandry. I'm yoking and whipping an ox all day, as opposed to hunting or gathering. It's a totally different set of behaviors, a totally different worldview, a totally different conditioning of my experience and my belief. And so that tool actually ended animism, but it's important to also understand that it grew the populations because you could create a lot more caloric surplus. So the populations that had it in warfare would totally beat the other populations, which means that for any other population that was like, no, we don't want to use the plow, we think that's kind of evil and horrible, they're going to get killed in tribal warfare at some point. Or just radically overpopulated and become increasingly a smaller percentage of how the world is stewarded. So it's not only that technology ends up affecting the nature of human minds and cultures, it's that it also becomes obligate.
I've never heard that idea that tech is not neutral. I think that's really interesting, and it made me think of like the biggest inventions throughout our history, like writing or electricity, and what did those kill, or what did those?
Oh, yes. So there are great philosophers of technology who discuss this in depth with very different views. Lewis Mumford is great to read. Marvin Harris is great to read. So For instance, many indigenous cultures hold that the written word was the downfall of humanity. And that's so different than the way we think about it, right? We think about it as like one of the greatest inventions of all time that allowed us to store knowledge, accumulate knowledge, coordinate at a distance, like all these types of things. So I won't explain the kind of Western narrative of why we like written language. It's kind of obvious, but I'll describe the indigenous perspective as, so again, that written language is not that old, right? 10,000, give or take a couple thousand years. For hundreds of thousands of years, there were humans that had cultures, that had stories, that had creation myths, that had systems of medicine, that had music, that had, a whole way of being. And their intergenerational knowledge transmission, without being based on the written word, was things like at the center of the tribe was the relationship between the old people and the young people. And the old people, who had amassed the most knowledge and wisdom throughout their life, spending a lot of time with the young people, was actually what was considered the central sacred thing the tribe was doing. The kind of middle-aged people were really supporting that knowledge transmission. And so I remember a Native American describing why the written word was the downfall to me the first time. And he said, in the past, if we had an old person who had something meaningful to share, rather than spend their time with a book and write it in a decontextualized linear fashion that would appeal to some people in some contexts and not others, where also the love can't be transmitted, he spent all of his time, or she spent all of her time, with kids and with young people, making sure they really got it, making sure they connected it to everything else, teaching it in a way that was unique to them, and teaching it in a bunch of different ways that allowed to make sure it was really embodied. And the kid didn't spend time as one of 30 kids in a classroom with someone paid to take care of them who doesn't actually love them and doesn't actually have that much embodied wisdom. They spent time with the people that had the most wisdom, who were totally invested in them. And so it's very interesting to think about that they would have always been learning the content in a context, right? In different contexts. If I'm learning about a tree when we're harvesting apples versus when we are seeing if there's, some bug damaging it that we're trying to protect it from, versus when we're harvesting wood, versus when we're praying to the trees, versus, like they're different contexts. We learn different things about it. So rather than here's what a tree is, removed from context, that key to the nature of the teaching. So the written word linearizes thought. You have to have a beginning, middle, end of the thing. It takes a specific context and it freezes the content in that context. It separates the relationship between the teacher and the learner, right? There's all those things that it does. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that are very powerful about that. Everybody can get the same content across a huge population. It can allow for coordination, all those kinds of things. But yes, if you go through and look at all of our technology, as soon as smartphones became ubiquitous, almost everybody's sense of direction went away very quickly. And intrinsic to following the GPS tool that was super useful was no longer orienting to space and no longer creating maps of space, which is a totally different relation. It's a decreased awareness of your environment. Decreased awareness of environment is a huge part of the problems in the world. So when you start to realize that if tech is useful, you use it, that changes the patterns of behavior. That changes the conditioning of the person. If it confers advantage, everybody has to use it or they lose advantage, so it becomes obligate. Then we call it human nature.